Just to introduce you folks to how I got interested in psychedelics. This is the article that I saw when I was a kid. With LSD, I saw God. And I became curious because the whole idea of being able to see God seemed very helpful, because I was frustrated. I would say, "Where is God?" And my relatives would say, "God is everywhere." And then some of them would point to the crucifix on the wall. None of it was very helpful. And God seemed so important, but nobody seemed to really actually take it all that seriously. And so and so then I got a little older, and I was able to take myself off to San Francisco, and I experienced LSD there at the age of 12, and that changed a lot of the rest of my life. It affected me much as you might expect. I seemed to have a spiritual disposition already. And so when I was 19, with my wife here shown on this screen, we went to India, went to Varanasi, and we lived there in houseboats on the Ganges, and were able to study Buddhism in Bodh Gaya. And when we returned, we studied Buddhism with a Lama in Oregon for about 20 years. And then at some point had to take care of the 3 kids that we'd had. And so I went to UCLA Law School and became a lawyer. That was 30 years ago. And my first experiences as a lawyer were in corporate law. I worked in big law for one of the largest firms in the world, Morgan, Lewis and Bockius. And then I worked for another firm that's now part of Ropes and Gray that works for Goldman Sachs. So as I say there, but for the grace of God, go I. I became interested in representing individuals rather than mega corporations. And I went to work for a small personal injury firm in Los Angeles then, and did a lot of litigation on behalf of individuals suing large corporations. At some point, I decided that human liberty was more interesting than money. And so I became a criminal lawyer. I was a prosecutor in Oregon, did domestic violence and basically petty crimes, DUIs for a while. I decided it wasn't for me to be putting people in jail. And so I became a defense lawyer. I was a federal public defender, did a lot of work involving controlled substances, became very familiar with the Controlled Substances Act and drug prosecutions, the severe consequences that people suffer from doing things that I had done. Then eventually I got out of the criminal law business and got into intellectual property, which I did for I still do intellectual property, but the opportunity to work with Scott Stanley and the Arizona Yahe Assembly presented itself, and we started working together. And that has brought me full circle to my original passion and interest in being able to help people to gain lawful access to the psychedelic experience, and particularly in the religious context. So now, as a lawyer, one of my duties is to give people bad news. Unfortunately, that seems to be a big part of it. Napoleon here had a saying, whoa, wait a minute. Napoleon had a saying that you can't wait to hear bad news. Bad news has to be heard immediately. Good news can wait. So what is the bad news? And the bad news is that visionary churches are oppressed. And this image here shows you the catacombs in Rome. Those are sepulchres on either side. And you probably recall that the early Christians practiced in basically the underground graveyards of Rome. And in this case, they were able to decorate their place of worship. But they suffered tremendous oppression, which we've known about since our childhood. But we don't really want to think that much about the oppression that we ourselves are suffering due to the way the laws are. But the reality is that we are suffering from oppression. And can I ask a question here to resume letting you see my face? Is that just a matter of clicking on my image over there to the right?
We can see your face in addition to what you're showing us on the screen. If, like, I can see everybody's face on the side of the...
Great, great. Thank you very much. I hadn't thought of that, Eric. Appreciate that. Okay, so I'll just continue the way we're working right now. What are some of the negative consequences of the legal oppression that visionary churches are suffering from? Well, one of the things, and it's kind of funny, is that we don't get to put up funny signs like this. You see these all over the place, but we can't put up any signs like that. And for that matter, we can't do a bake sale. Not unless you're pretty intrepid. Fundraising is impaired. Our ability to communicate is impaired. Practitioners will not even tell their family about it. They often cannot tell their employer, or if they have employees, they can't tell their employees. This kind of secrecy has a way of working itself into the mindset. My own feeling is that the shadow of illegality throws the entire experience into another key that we are not strongly aware of, but it is affecting us. We have what are called legal disabilities. For example, should we have to go to court, we might find our ability to testify impaired. Someone might threaten us and say, if you go to court and you testify against me, I'll report you to law enforcement or child protective services. I know what you're doing. And I think as we reflect on it, we'll find that a lot of people have had experiences of that sort, been put under some sort of pressure or another because of their religious practices. Now, some churches, and here are some Diamond practitioners, some churches have obtained unquestioned legal freedom to practice, but most churches don't really enjoy that. What freedom we do have, we owe in large part to the Native American people, who, through the peyote religion, have gained legal sanction for their practice through great difficulty, many years of struggle, many years of litigation, and ultimately getting acts of Congress to help them to be free of persecution. But the path that the Native American people walked to get to their current status was very difficult. They had already suffered genocidal colonialism. They'd had their game animals killed off, their entire lifestyle being destroyed, their children put into institutions, not allowed to learn their native language. And from this, they reached out to the visionary experience to reclaim their heritage and to find a way out of alcoholism. That is one of the central tenets of the Native American Church. And they have struggled for many years, and all of us who have connections with visionary churches owe them a tremendous debt of thanks, and I believe need to draw inspiration from the way that they have struggled. The current situation that we find ourselves in is that the DEA has promulgated this document that I'm showing here called the Guidance Regarding Petitions for Religious Exemption from the Controlled Substances Act, pursuant to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The core there is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was enacted after Judge Scalia adopted a decision where they authored a decision that impaired even the ability of the Native American church members to practice without legal consequences. And the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, I've explained it in some articles that I've presented online, but the reality is that, here's another article that I've written, be careful for what you wish for. The peril of regulated status for psychedelic churches is that I think that there is something fundamentally wrong with having the Drug Enforcement Administration acting as a regulator of religion. And this article that I wrote explains why there might be serious problems with that and legal problems, as in there's a conflict with the First Amendment. The First Amendment allows free exercise. It also prevents the establishment of a religion. And under the Establishment Clause, the government is not supposed to be engaged in the regulation of religion. But if we look at the guidance regarding petitions for religious exemption, what we find is that there are many faults in the system. What are those faults if one were to seek an exemption from the DEA? I'm scrolling through this article that I've written because it has what I call a thorough legal analysis that concludes that the guidance is unconstitutionally interferes with freedom of religion and is vulnerable to legal challenge. And then I went through the primary legal defects of the guidance, which I'll go through with you here right now. The first one is that the guidance compels self-incrimination. The guidance actually requires church leaders to make statements under oath in what I call a PRE, a petition for religious exemption. And those statements actually could provide probable cause to arrest the individual who signed the PRE. It could be grounds for issuing search warrants of the places where sacramental controlled substances are kept or distributed. And just to put it simply, a properly computed PRE would provide a roadmap for prosecution of church members for conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. This is, I think, people actually intuit this. They don't need a lawyer to tell them about it. They realize that this is the case. That's the reason that no one, except for a couple of churches that have been tapped on the shoulder by the DEA, have ever actually filed those petitions for religious exemption. The second big problem with the guidance that the DEA promulgated is that it suspends the right to partake of the sacrament. This is a big problem for any church. By submitting a petition for religious exemption, the submitting church basically promises that it will not allow its members to use the sacrament until the petition is adjudicated. So it trades off the free exercise of its members for the hope of attaining legal status. But there's something really ironic about that, because by not using the controlled substances for an extended period of time, an applicant church undercuts its contention that psychedelic communion is essential to its religious path, and that laws forbidding use of the sacrament substantially burden its right to freedom of religion. So any church that files a petition for a religious exemption is really shooting themselves in the foot because they're taking the sacrament away from their people in the hope of getting a long-term benefit, and they are actually disproving the contention that the sacrament is essential to their religious practice. It's not like Catholics could stop taking communion for a couple of years while the government decides whether taking communion is a good thing for them or for society. And the third problem with the guidance is that it requires submitters to undertake a risk of perjury. These applications have to be submitted under penalty of perjury and making a false statement, 5-year maximum sentence. So there's obviously some serious problems. Perjury charges could be premised on material omissions, or if some members of the church failed to keep the promise, to abstain from taking the sacrament. Fourth reason that is very obvious for those of us who have followed the cases of the ayahuasca healings group and the Soul Quest group that both filed petitions for religious exemption is that, actually I'm going to jump down here to the fifth one, the guidance allows the DEA an indefinite period for processing the PRA. It's apparently the DEA has not felt under any obligation to adjudicate the applications that have been submitted in a couple of years since those have been submitted. And obviously that means that the commitment not to take the sacrament, basically, and a prohibition that lasts for an unlimited and very lengthy period of time. The guidance also allows unlimited scope to request for further information. The guidance says that the DEA can ask for additional information anytime it wants, and there are several precedents in law, cases that have already been decided, that says government agency doesn't have to grant a license if an applicant refuses to provide requested information. So the DEA has an additional means of providing a denial because it's a foolproof pretext. All they have to do to refuse to grant exemption is just request additional incriminating information that goes beyond what the church would reasonably want to provide. The sixth concern is that the DEA uses the guidance as a cover for issuing executive in what we call investigative demands. This occurred in the case of both Soul Quest and the ayahuasca healings. Neither of these groups had shown any inclination to submit a PRE, but when they were tapped on the shoulder and invited to do so, they felt obligated. Now, I'm going to go back to this article. Be careful what you wish for, the peril of regulated status for psychedelic churches. Just remember that article, because in it I explain why, even if a church gets a demand or invitation from the DEA to present a PRE, it can be refused on First Amendment grounds. Obviously, it's too late to refuse it if you voluntarily do it. Finally, and this is a very important one, even though saved for last, the guidance was issued without notice and opportunity for public comment. And this is a violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. The guidance was never published in the Federal Register. It was issued without any formal notice of rulemaking or opportunity for public comment. And because the guidance establishes regulations that have a legislative effect, imposing additional restraints on religious groups that go beyond those authorized by Congress, the DEA should have given that notice. And therefore, the guidance was issued in violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. Well, I did say that I had good news to go along with the bad news. And there are a number of pieces of good news. One of the first ones is that this is quite surprising. On May 4th, 2017, President Donald Trump issued an executive order called Promoting Speech, Free Speech, and Religious Liberty. That caused Attorney General Jeff Sessions, former Attorney General at this point, to issue a memorandum entitled Federal Law Protections for Religious Liberty. And what this did was that told all federal agencies throughout the United States government to pay very close attention to any rules or regulations that they had in existence that would interfere with the free exercise of religion. And Jeff Sessions told all of the agencies to avoid interference with the free exercise of religion and to bring all their regulations into compliance with the requirements of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. He issued a memorandum directed to all federal governments, agencies, telling them to proactively accommodate the needs of churches seeking exemptions from general law. It tells prosecutors that to satisfy RFRA's limitations on burdening religion, the government may have to spend more money, modify existing federal exemptions, or create new programs. And RFRA applies to all actions, including rulemaking. Sessions' memo tells government agencies that when a law or regulation fails to pass RFRA's strict scrutiny test, which Sessions calls exceptionally demanding, a religious exemption must be granted, even when it requires the reduction of the rights of third persons. And that goes to the matter of not having to, Christian bakers not having to bake gay wedding cakes or sew lesbian wedding dresses. This memorandum was not promulgated for the benefit of visionary churches. But I have a saying, which is take them at their word. And the Sessions memorandum is good news because it gives us an opportunity to approach the DEA using the words of the Attorney General himself to present our request to bring that exemption process into compliance with, to bring the guidance into compliance with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Now, it may very well be that in order to bring it fully into compliance with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it has to change radically. And that is my belief, is that if the issues are presented to the DEA, the groundwork will be laid for taking us to the next stage in the evolution of the legality of visionary religion. Now, a little bit more good news. Something that we know has been happening is that the general climate of understanding towards the use of psychedelics, visionary substances, has been improving. I'm displaying here this article referring to how Oakland and Denver have now both decriminalized, they're called magic mushrooms, which we know, of course, are the sacred mushrooms of the Mesoamerican people. We know that Johns Hopkins has found that psilocybin derived from psychedelic mushrooms has positive and lasting effects, as this headline here states. And so, in other words, the political attitude is being liberalized and the scientific knowledge is coming out of the closet that it was driven into after the LSD scare that occurred in the 60s and early 70s that resulted in psychedelics being put into Schedule I category, where they have languished ever since. Now, the next thing that is positive is that we can, in fact, act together as a group. And what I titled this article here that I'm scrolling up to, it is time for an association of visionary churches to stand up and claim the religious freedom to which they're entitled. The advantage of working through an association of visionary churches is that churches and individuals can litigate through an association while keeping their anonymity, not being exposed to being prosecuted or having themselves exposed to investigative scrutiny by law enforcement, much as a person can join the Sierra Club or Wave Riders, one of these other environmental organizations, and contribute to the process of litigating for the benefit of the environment without exposing themselves to being identified as eco-activists, if that were a negative thing. In the same way, individual churches will be able to act through an association of visionary churches and be able to work together. How does this work? Well, in court, the first thing that you have to establish is that you have standing to appear there and present your controversy for adjudication by the court. And just like the Sierra Club can act on behalf of concerned individuals, so in the same way, an association of visionary churches can assert the same standing that its members would have. Now, how is it possible that they could keep the identity of the member churches anonymous if the churches desired that? Well, that was established in a case called Albertson versus the name of the government entity escapes me right now, but suffice it to say, it was litigation in which the United States government tried to force the American Communist Party to give up its membership lists. That litigation reached the United States Supreme Court, and it was held by the court, and that in other cases as well in the lower court. Now it's a well-established rule that individuals and organizations can keep their membership in a group secret if that disclosure would expose them to potential Fifth Amendment consequences of self-incrimination. So while given the current climate, it might not even be important to individual churches or individuals to keep their membership in an association of visionary churches secret. It is that possibility of maintaining anonymity is there. Now, to speak a little bit about the plans for where we stand with the North American Association of Visionary Churches. This entity has been incorporated as a California nonprofit association. As a California nonprofit, we will be able to pursue litigation in the California federal courts on behalf of member churches. California courts are in the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit has a relatively enlightened jurisprudence under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Thanks to the Supreme Court having established in the UDV case some very helpful standards for the protection of visionary religion, and the Ninth Circuit having implemented those rules in a way that is faithful to their intention, I think that the California location of incorporation will be beneficial. The NAAVC has already planned out its legal approach, which would begin with an approach to the DEA, invoking Attorney General Sessions' memorandum regarding how religious exemptions should be granted. We would seek to open a dialogue with the DEA, which is exactly what Jeff Sessions had in mind when he wrote the memo. He says that federal agencies should be proactive in adapting themselves to the needs of churches. So like I say, while he probably did not have visionary churches in mind when he wrote it, nevertheless, the law does apply equally. And the truth of the matter is that the UDV case is the single most powerful case in establishing the strength of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that law is very important to Christian churches that are pursuing their own independent social agenda. But the benefit of the law accrues to visionary churches, and I think that visionary churches would be remiss in not taking up the opening that's presented there. So if the DEA is not amenable to reconsidering the exemption process, and I have no reason to be pessimistic except for the fact that the DEA has given people working in this field considerable reason to be pessimistic. Their rigidity with regard to even considering the descheduling of cannabis, marijuana, getting it out of Schedule I, suggests to me that they might not be all that flexible. And accordingly, litigation might have to be pursued. Again, NAAVC would be able to pursue that litigation and seek for general changes in the law. Individual churches could participate in that, as I have said, anonymously. So with that, I think I've said everything I had in mind to say, and I could open it up to some questions.
Hi, Charles. This is Kevin. Thanks so much for doing this. This is great information. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of the NAAVC and like who is that made up of? You know, it sounds like it's just been hatched, but any information on that would be great.
Right. Yes. At this stage, just to be very straightforward about it, we have a 3-member board. I'm on the board, Scott is on the board, and we have a member of a church other than the Arizona Yahe Assembly. We plan on keeping the board small for the immediate future. The bylaws have been written, and we're happy to share those. The bylaws provide 4 rotating board positions and what we call a staggered board, so that there will, when the third member will move out and be replaced, and then other members will come in, so we'll have some board continuity. There's no reason not to expand the board to a larger group, except my own belief is that at the beginning we have a concrete, clear mission, and we want to keep it focused. And so therefore, for probably the first year or 2, I think we would like to stay with a 3-member board. However, we are creating advisory boards as well. And the advisory boards would be focused on what we would call doing executive work, small groups of advisory board members who can focus on specific missions like communication, like legal issues. And the one that is dearest to my heart is to collect the science on the visionary substances that are used by churches. And of course, right now, I would say probably ayahuasca is certainly the most commonly used, but not the only one. But the science of ayahuasca has been advanced so greatly. I have had the privilege of communicating extensively and working with Professor Barbosa in Brazil, who brought me up to speed over the course of a collaboration that lasted a couple of months, and completely expanded my understanding of how far the research has gone. This research, and I do intend to invite Professor Barbosa to join an advisory board. This research that has been done during the last 10 years, not only in Brazil, but also in conjunction with Dr. Strassman of DMT, spirit molecule fame, at the University of New Mexico, is very persuasive to me, and I believe will be very persuasive in future litigation that is likely to be necessary. The status of member churches will be that of, they will have membership and they will receive equal rights and privileges. What we are intending to open up to the churches is to basically to help churches develop beyond the level that they're at, which is, as a practical matter, they are in the nascent stages, in the very early stages. One of the things that, from a legal perspective, I have seen when you read the case law, you think, well, the courts tend to ask themselves, does this church look like the Anglican church? And they sort of establish that checklist and saying, no, actually, it should probably look more like that church in the catacombs, if you want to be honest about it. It should look more like the kind of churches that St. Paul was addressing when he wrote epistles to the Ephesians and the Galatians and the various other churches in Ephesus. And these places were, literally in people's living rooms. These churches were sometimes living in very severe oppression. If you study the earliest Christian church documents, they are pleas to the Romans to stop killing them. They present their arguments in, I'm kind of choking up because it's very moving to me when I see the role that someone like Justin Martyr played in legitimizing Christianity. He literally had to beg for their lives. And he did so by arguing that they were good citizens and that Romans were rational people and that Romans respected law-abiding people and that Christians were law-abiding, honest, decent, good people and should be respected as such. That's the role that I see myself in, is to advance that argument, to get these churches out of an oppressed situation and into the free air and light that is available to all other religions. There's absolutely no reason why visionary churches should be considered second class. If history tells us anything, it's very likely that visionary religions were the very first religions of humanity. They are currently a tremendous resource for people who are under siege, who are hoping to save their planet, who are facing the same types of culturally destructive, planetary destructive forces as the peyote church practitioners were facing. Very dire situation. What we know about visionary religion is that it's probably very appropriate for such a time. It deserves to be made fully legitimate. So the first thing that I would give, if it were within my power, to the visionary churches that join as members, and to all visionary churches, whether they join or not, but would be a full understanding of the fact that we are in an oppressed state, that is a dignified position to be in, that we have much to offer the world, and that we should, with open eyes, proceed to make demand of our government, of law enforcement agencies, that what is right and good about these churches be recognized. And sharing that kind of information is the primary benefit that I see for the churches. I could see us graduating to a situation where the churches could become voting members as a synod, as some of the churches, Christian churches, have established in their nationwide and international conferences. At this point, we are wanting to keep our focus on our legal goals and our cultural and communication goals. And so, like I say, the leadership is kind of tightly controlled. Just be perfectly candid about that.
Sure.
But anybody who wants to be in leadership, sing out, find a place for you. Eric.
Three quick things, or maybe not. One, if you're done with the presentation, why don't you switch back to the other view so that if this is recorded, people can see you, because I believe it's only going to record what's on your main screen. That's
Okay.
my understanding of Zoom.
Show large active speaker video. There.
And Shelly, if you know different, feel free to correct me.
There, you're on.
Cool.
Are we good now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you very much, Eric. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and then so I have two quick questions. I was just recently an executive director of a nonprofit, and so I sort of understand the challenges in starting those things up. So one question, and I'll just ask you both and then let you talk about them. One question is there anybody else that you know of that's thinking about doing the same thing that you're talking about doing, putting together a coalition of religious visionary churches for the purpose of, you know, possible litigation or exploring the legal situation? So that's one question. And then the other is, have you done a projection of administrative costs? I mean, the volunteer time that goes into a nonprofit is immense, right? And I know you probably know that, and I know Scott knows that. And relying entirely on volunteers without some people being able to get paid for their work has predictable results. Like, stuff just doesn't get done on time a lot of the time, and that's okay when it's volunteers, but this is a very cool idea and something that I think is really important to a lot of us, and I would hate to see it stall out because there's not enough firepower. And one great way to get firepower is to pay somebody.
Yes, and I'm paid. Scott and I have had an excellent relationship for a couple of years now. I am paid very modestly for an attorney, but given my phase of life, it works for me.
Okay.
So when it comes to the legal side of it, we've got that covered, I believe. And I believe that I have been an attorney for 30 years. I've been I've been admitted to the federal courts, or the federal courts of California, and 3 appellate courts, the 9th Circuit, 2nd Circuit, 6th Circuit, for a long time. So I am experienced in what kind of time commitments it takes. The other thing is that I have been studying it for a long time and sort of warehousing knowledge and strategies and plans that I can now draw from. To return to your first question, though, is anybody else doing it? And the only reason I turned to Scott and said, do you think you'd like to try this, is because I spent months speaking with other attorneys and other folks in the field, scholars, and I gave every opportunity, and it was kind of, I thought we were going there with the group of people that I was working with. We had attorneys, we had people, we were 6, 7 people on the conference line, and I'm like, so when do we, start inviting churches in so that we can say that we actually have a group of churches that we represent? And then I found out, well, we're not really going to do that now. And at that point, I said, well, Scott, we seem to have graduated to the head of the line. We're either going to do it or we're going to wait, and we could be waiting forever. So that's how that happened. Now, as far as long-term, coming back around to the fact that I am paid doesn't mean that everyone and everything that needs to be done for the organization has been thought about and has been administrative planned. And when you say, have you looked at all your administrative costs? The answer is no. This is definitely a process that requires development. I've got a stack of I've got a stack of books that I'm reading right now. Started reading this book, which is Charity on Trial, fascinating book about nonprofits. I finished it. Been reading this other book, is seems like it comes from another realm, Capital Without Borders. This is about what the wealthy, the super rich, are doing with their money. But after reading them both, they are a twofer. You absolutely have to understand both of these. There is a tremendous amount of funding available for nonprofit institutions that are able to tap into it appropriately. I believe that one of the things that Arizona Yahya Assembly has done that absolutely, I should be clear, I am not an ayahuasca drinker myself. I'm just devoted to the cause. I had a couple of experiences and that's all I needed. And, AYA did a survey and we designed a questionnaire. I think it had about 80 questions. And this would be one of the things that we would be happy to share with other member churches is our work product. Suffice it to say, after I saw the results, we had 268 respondents, sufficient percentage to make that statistically reliable given the total number of questionnaires that were circulated. And when it was over, I said to Scott, I said, well, you know, Scott, you really don't have to worry that you're wasting your life because I have never known of anyone who was doing work that people were so happy with. You got a 98% satisfaction rating for this experience. The individual stories that several people, you know, who said that they had complete cures from substance abuse, other people who had crippling emotional problems that were transcended. I think that when you have institutions that are bringing forth this kind of benefit, that those people are going to be willing to not just devote time, but also financial resources. The demographics that I saw in the survey were also quite interesting. Many people of my age, and I'm 63, all of the vast, solid plurality of people in their 40s and over. Very solid majority of people in above 60% who came exclusively for a spiritual or religious quest purpose. Other people filling out the ranks, seeking healing, seeking to deal with personal suffering. Some relatively few people, I think we literally had, I think, one person out of 268 respondents who said they viewed it as recreational. That was like it. So my feeling is that there will, in fact, if we can create an organization that is really about strengthening the dignity and the confidence of churches and church leaders, getting us out of the catacombs and into the light, that we will find that programs of planned giving will be very successful. When you have that many people in that demographic structure and the educational level was also quite high, these things add up to people with resources. And, you know, the Yankelevich survey people, they describe the boomer generation as people who are going to live longer and do more for the world. So I think that we can activate that membership and that we can thereby get resources that will make a program of strengthening, like I say, the dignity and legality and the openness of it. I think we won't have too much trouble moving on. I think in all candor, my biggest concern is that everything be done with the highest level of ethics and sincerity and honesty, because I actually feel that the amount of energy that is already pouring into this space is so large that it has in fact attracted some people who are not acting from the highest ethical position. That we need to change that, you know. We need to improve the understanding of what it means to be an ethical church leader, and we need to share the kind of knowledge that makes that easy for churches to do, so that people really do feel that it's a safe, pro-social, you know, as the language goes, movement. And I think once that happens, I think the resources they'll actually be more than we need, and we'll have to be wise in applying them. I sincerely believe.
Hey, Charles, Kevin again. Different direction slightly. There seems to be little appetite right now for prosecution. So you have at least 3 churches that have stuck their head up, right? AYA, Soul Quest, Aya Quest, and the guys out of Washington, Aya Healing. So I guess 4. A couple of them have gotten, I think they've probably all gotten the DEA tap. A couple of them have responded. A ton of other folks are in the cottage, you know, underground, in the catacombs, as you say. We haven't run across, or at least I haven't run across in my research, any appetite for prosecution, and it's out there. Just comment about that. Have you guys run across anything else? Is that what you're seeing as well? And what's driving that? I mean, is it the fear, or not the fear, just the recognition of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the UDV decision? You know, what's behind that lack of zeal?
Mm-hmm. I think that I think you put your finger on it. The United States Supreme Court weighed in with a very powerful decision. I tell you, when I read it back in, I guess it was 2004, I don't know how it came up on my radar, but it was the last thing I expected. A unanimous decision from basically a Catholic Supreme Court that basically took this law, and believe me, as a lawyer, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act looked strange, because what it does is it says to the Supreme Court, it says, guys, you got it wrong. When Justice Scalia wrote Oregon versus Smith, it made a mistake. When it departed from Sherbert versus Werner, it made a mistake. Turn the dial back to the other setting and impose strict scrutiny on government regulations that inhibit free exercise of religion. When I read it, I thought, wow, I've never heard of such a law. And if you dig into it, there were a number of legal scholars, that's unconstitutional, that doesn't fly, that doesn't work. You can't tell the Supreme Court to talk like that. You know, Justice Marshall's turning over in his grave. Well, Justice Marshall may well be turning over in his grave. Nevertheless, what they did was they turned it back to a dial setting where the Supreme Court had previously been. It wasn't like they came up with a new one and said, be more severe on the government than you're. They're like, no. They said, it was fine before. Do it that way. And the Roberts Court, I mean, really, it was like a Hail Mary pass from Congress, you know, and the Roberts Court just said, yeah, we're going for the finish line. Boom, 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 straight through the goalpost. And so really shocking to me. And I think shocked the DEA. They have attempted to resuscitate their arguments. If you read the cases that followed up, and one of the great things about the courts being online now was that I was able to read basically the entire trial process of the Dimey case in Oregon before Judge Panner. Judge Panner was a wonderful guy. I was an Oregon federal public defender. Judge Panner was beloved because he had a very compassionate, intelligent mind. And he had represented Indian tribes for like a dozen years before he was elevated to the bench. And he showed such clear understanding of how to apply the Supreme Court standard that he ordered the DEA to pay $1.15 million in attorney's fees. We don't really know how that turned out unless Jonathan Goldman wants to tell us, because they appealed from that and then it went back down. And furthermore, when the DEA said, well, we want to wrap you all up in red tape, the DIME said, okay, well, a little bit of red tape is okay. Judge Banner said, no, just kicked it back and gave him a one-line injunction and said, basically, don't mess with it. Based on that rubric, I think that what the DEA thinks is we don't want to mess with it too much. It's already gotten bad. If you read Ninth Circuit decisions, you've got people being busted with 10,000 marijuana plants and saying, I'm a Rastafarian. And the Ninth Circuit goes through a diligent RFRA application and says, no, we can't just brush this aside. But in the end, you know what? To be a Rastafarian, you only need a few spleefs. You don't need 10,000 plants. Interesting cases, fun to read. Bottom line is that, and the other thing is that RFRA, because it is in fact the basis for the you don't have to bake a gay wedding cake cases. You don't have to sew a lesbian wedding dress case. Maybe you don't need to have 3 bathrooms at the elementary school. These kinds of things. Maybe you don't have to, in the Hobby Lobby case, you're a religious corporation. Hobby Lobby, a religious corporation. They don't have to provide contraceptives under the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. Yeah, they're going to provide insurance. They don't have to provide contraceptives. Well, those are the kinds of decisions that the Department of Justice is solidly behind. Interestingly enough, to keep them, they can't attack the UDV case. So the foundation of jurisprudence is bound up in this utterly strange social agenda that most visionary church practitioners have little interest in. Nevertheless, we find ourselves sheltering under the same statute. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's part of it. I think the other part is that that ayahuasca churches are by and large doing good work, and they are sticking within, if you actually look at them and you apply the standard that Judge Panner applied in the DIME case and that the Supreme Court applied, but they're more fleshed out in the DIME case. If you actually apply the standards, if you grabbed in most ayahuasca churches, they're pretty much fitting in there. They have one sacrament. They use it ceremonially. They don't have children in their practices. They're not using multiple substances. You're not having problems. I mean, people aren't showing up at the hospital saying, oh, what happened? Oh, I was in ayahuasca ceremony. That's not happening. People are taking care of each other. People taking care of themselves. So I don't know why I lost your video, but.
We still see a little bit.
Okay, great.
I just have one final question. Do you have any guidelines? So we know there's you mentioned earlier, it's true, right? So the Myers test basically took the current, Christian church and said, okay, we're just going to codify this. And it looks like a congregation and it looks like, all these kind of, all these requirements. Do you have thoughts on, just that, like the Myers test and how it would apply, or is there, you have to be written down on what, how far can you roll that back and still be considered a church?
I'm not a Myers fan. As far as I can see, what we've got is, if the reason Myers is still talked about a lot is because the DEA, in rejecting applications like Church of Reality, applies the Myers test. That's a classic case of what I say. Does it look like an Anglican church?
Yeah.
And why should it? It should look more like a barefoot apostle type of church. That's where it's about at, So my own feeling is I post my articles to researchgate.net, and you can start a project there. And I just started a project. I entitled my project Toward a Modern Jurisprudence of Psychedelic Religion. And my own inclination as a lawyer is to rely on what I would call an anthropological definition of religion, which is that religion is what people do in order to be religious. And religion is what people do in order to fulfill spiritual needs and to combine ethical impulses with a context that goes beyond rationale, beyond reason. It touches the heart and motivates people at a deeper level than you can do with merely rational incentives. We can motivate people to a lot of ethical behavior by threatening them with punishment and rewarding them with material goods. But we still see that the greatest expressions of human goodness occur for no reason at all, as they say. You know, the humongous outpourings of charity donations, so much of what is stolen by scammers these days, a true tragedy. But nevertheless, you know, when those faces come over the internet, people are clicking, people are giving their money, they want to help. Religion taps that. And so what I look at is saying, rather than looking at historical cases like Myers, which most importantly is not a Supreme Court case, and cases that, you know, that have arisen out of what I think of as, you know, the Neo-American Church case, which is, I believe, the Myers case. It was a silly thing that was actually very uncool for the boohoos to do. If you know who those people were, they were, you know, they were like outcasts at Millbrook. Go figure, you know. It was irresponsible. It is foolish to go to the church and tell them that your religious hymn is row, row, row your boat. This is like Take Two, they're small. You know what? That doesn't go down with the black robed ones. You know, they want a little solemnity. They want a little sincerity, you know. And so I would say, what do? We go to the science. I mentioned Professor Barbosa, who by the time I was done working with him, I wanted to hug him. I mean, literally, the knowledge that he brought. And I have a declaration from him that, you know, it's incredible the way it lays out all of the established benefits that have been shown by the ayahuasca churches. It's really quite remarkable. And so I'm hoping that we can build on science, sociology, and anthropology so that religion is judged based on what it accomplishes for humanity rather than how much it looks like some other church.